Welcome at Rick's Europe. This weekend, elections took place in Austria, and the Freedom Party of Austria secured an impressive 30% of the vote, becoming the largest party in the national elections. Now, the FPL, under leadership of Kickl, has a campaign that really promised to put Austrians first. The question, however, remains if they can deliver on the promise to build this Austrian fort, because the established parties have already said not to be willing to form a government with the Freedom Party of Austria. Now, with me today is Ralph Schoellhammer. He is an established political commentator, journalist, lecturer, podcaster. Ralph, thank you and welcome.
Hi Scarlett, thanks so much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be on with you.
Let's start from the beginning. Okay, so they won the elections, and of course, you read the media, and what they say is, oh my god, there's this extreme right party which is founded by Nazi ideology. What is going on? Are they really that extreme? Because from what I read, they are just simply putting Austrians first.
No, I mean, every party has its extreme fringe, and that's not different for a right-wing party as it is not different for left-wing parties. But the actual party program, the actual ideas and policies the party wants to implement, there's nothing radical about it. It's very much in line. Their economic program is pretty much the same as the Conservative Party's program, but they are more outspoken on the matter of migration, which is, of course, a key topic all over Europe, or I would actually say all over the West. What is true, of course, is that, and you mentioned this originally when you say put Austrians first, they had an Austria first policy going back to the early 1990s. So in 1990, in 1992 to be precise, they even held a referendum in Austria that had the title Austria First. So I always claim that right-wing populism or successful right-wing populism had its beginnings in Austria with the Freedom Party. Now, they had their ups and downs. They had a tendency to implode when they got too powerful. So I think they will be very cautious now moving forward. You're absolutely right. It's the first time since 1945 that neither the Conservatives nor the Social Democrats came in first in national elections. So the Freedom Party, I think, will be very careful how they treat these mandates they got from the public, from the population. And what they will not do, I think this is what Geert Wilders did in the Netherlands, they will not act as the loser after an election they actually won. So I think the strategy by the other parties is that they think they can tell the Freedom Party now who's supposed to be in charge, right? Whom they can put into the chancellorship, whom they could nominate for secretaries of state, for state offices. And I think the FPÖ is going to say, listen, we came in first, we won this election. Either you enter a coalition with us and we call the shots as the senior partner, or we stay in opposition, which I honestly think is the right strategy.
How will it continue moving forward? Because as we mentioned before, the two other established parties have clearly said we're not going to form a coalition with you. First and foremost, what does this exclusion say about the state of democracy, the fact that the party gets a majority of the votes, 30%, and still other parties are saying we're not going to form a government with you? You're basically saying to the voters, we don't care about your vote, we don't care what you want, because it is not what we want so far to democracy. Can you say more about that?
Well, let's put it this way. It's the leaders of the current parties, of the Social Democrats and the Conservatives, who say they won't enter a coalition with the Freedom Party. It's not the entirety of their parties. So we'll see what's going to happen in the next couple of days, but it's absolutely not outside of the imaginable that one of those party leaders, especially the current head of the Conservative Party, Karl Nehammer, and also the current chancellor, that he gets ousted by his own party, somebody else takes over, and that new person then says, you know what? The firewall against the Freedom Party, that was my predecessor's policy. I'm entirely open to working with them. So in Austria, as we all know, the things that are being said before an election have a very limited shelf life after the election. So once push comes to shove, because somebody needs to form a government. So I'm not entirely certain if this talk about a firewall or whatever they want to call it will last very long. Now, at the moment, if I would have to bet, I would say it's going to be a coalition of the Conservatives, the Social Democrats, and the Liberals. So a kind of a right-of-center version of the German left-of-center traffic light government. But I would not say that it is set in stone, because these three parties don't like each other very much either. So it's not that they have lots of overlap when it comes to policy. And that's the absurdity. The Conservatives and the Freedom Party have an overlap in their program of about 80 to 85%. So it's also only, kind of issues of personality, of character, if you want, that prevents them from entering into a coalition government. But answering your question about democracy, I mean, at the end of the day, they need to form a government that furthers the well-being of the Austrian people, not going into a coalition with somebody at whom they, quote unquote, like. This is not a Tinder match or something about finding your life partner. This is like finding a business partner, and you want to get the best possible business partner to run the best possible business. So I'm not entirely sure if this firewall is going to hold as fiercely and strongly as they claim it will.
That's a very interesting comparison. But let's say these elections are sort of a Tinder match, then it's obvious what the people have voted for. They do want to have a government with the FPO. And in case they will succeed, which we all hope for, what will that mean in terms of policies? Do you think they can actually really drive some changes? Or, as what I read in an article, is that the grip of the people parties on Austria politics remains firmly intact?
Yeah, no, and I think it's even more than that, because what you then start to see emerging in parts of Western Europe, but especially in Central Europe, is a significant national conservative right-wing bloc, right? There are differences. Some of them are more to the right than others. Some of them are more pragmatic than others. But then you have Giorgia Meloni, which is of course more southern Italy, but I can include her in this nonetheless. You have Giorgia Meloni in Italy. You have Fico in Slovakia. You have Babiš in the Czech Republic. You have of course Viktor Orban in Hungary. Then you would have Kickl in Austria. We'll see what the future is going to bring next year in Germany and the year after that in France. So what we can see now, and I think the FPÖ would play a pivotal role in this, is a shift of Europe to the right. I mean, the voters have shifted to the right, a while ago. But I think now we have reached a point where the actual political parties are increasingly, or at least the parties that people vote for, are following them down that trajectory. So I think that's an interesting thing, because when the FPÖ was first in government in the early 2000s, basically everybody outside of Austria within the EU was against them, because they were the only clearly right-wing party in Europe that had the responsibility of being in government, right? Don't forget, this was in early 2000. This was even before the expansion of the EU into Eastern Europe. So Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, they were not members of the EU at that time. That happened 4 years later. So now the power dynamics have already shifted within the EU, with Eastern and Central Europe playing a more important role, and with Eastern and Central Europe becoming more right-wing. So I think this would be, not just for Austria, but I think it would just reinforce once again the European shift to the right, which I think is, but that's a personal opinion, which I think is a shift we should all welcome.
It's interesting what you're mentioning right now, because I read this article where actually an ambassador in the EU said that the win of the FPÖ will definitely not make any differences when it comes to policies in the EU. They seem to be kind of out of touch with reality, because like you mentioned, in the past elections, it has been right-wing parties that have triumphed and had massive victories. Are they really that delusional?
Yes. Yes, no, absolutely. They have not realized that the EU of 2024 is not the EU of 2004. Things have changed. It's now 27 members, and back in the day it was about a dozen members, right? It was I think it was 15 members at the time. So things are different now, and the European people have changed. This is, I think, one of the most important observations. Take just one party as an example. Take social democracy. Basically, social democracy all over Europe is dying. They had the worst results in these elections in Austria since 1907. They were once a party that had 38%. Now they barely made 20%. In Germany, according to current polls, they are somewhere around 14 to 15%. And just keep in mind, that's the party who is currently having the chancellor, right? Who's currently staffing the chancellorship. In France, social democracy is dead, right? In Spain, we'll see where it's going, but almost the same. So social democracies are dying all over Europe. And I think that the Greens are about to follow them, because most Europeans at this point are worried about culture, customs, social cohesion, pretty much all the things that are very closely connected to the negative consequences of mass migration. And as long as parties don't pick that up, the big exemption here are the Danish Social Democrats, because they realized what voters care about and they adapted their program. The same, I would argue, is true in Sweden. Now, parties can change. If they adapt to the will of the voter, they can still be around. But to answer your question about this delusional, European bureaucrat, it's Brussels is in a bubble, and I think that they still don't get where the journey is going.
Okay, Ralph Schoellhammer, you have whipped the hammer. Thank you so much for being with us here today. And of course,
Thank you, Scarlett.
you.